Hi everyone. So let's go ahead and take a look at our section 4 of chapter 23, which is covering the lungs. So before we go ahead and do that, let's remind ourselves what we looked at last time in the last video, and that was looking at the lower respiratory tract. So this is a really good table that you can use to kind of go through the functions. Epithelial lining is here as well, and anything else you want to know about the lower respiratory tract. Just make sure you know most gas exchange, because of the surface area, is going to come from those alveoli. So that's kind of important to point out, even though it talks about respiratory bronchioles and alveolar ducts, most of it is going to happen in those alveoli. So as far as what we're going to be covering in the lungs, we're going to be taking a look at just the kind of general anatomy of the lungs. We'll talk about circulation, innervation. We'll look at the pleural membranes, and then we'll take a look at these properties that are going to keep the lungs inflated. So let's go ahead and look at just the location, general structure of the lungs. So here they are, right? Most people know where those lungs are. Of course, they are going to be behind that rib cage. As you can see, there's a lot of anatomy here that we're not going to cover. So if you're going into a respiratory field of allied health, then you might want to go ahead and read up more about it in the book as far as the anatomy. Unfortunately, we just don't have a whole lot of time to cover everything in this respiratory system because it is quite a large chapter. So as far as what the lungs are going to be made of, it's going to be where the bronchial tree, most of the bronchial tree is going to be found in here. So everything from the secondary bronchi all the way down to the alveoli is going to be found here in the lungs. The very inferior part of the primary bronchi are going to be found in the lungs, but remember that the primary bronchi that branches off of the trachea, remember those are going to kind of sit outside of the lungs. Everything else, as far as the rest of the tissue of the lung, is going to be mainly elastic tissue. So let's take a look at a little bit of a different view, and we can kind of get an idea as far as comparing the right and the left lung. So look at the right lung and compare it to the left lung. So as you can see, the right lung is going to be wider, and it's going to be larger than the left lung. The left lung is going to be a little bit narrower and smaller. And remember, it's mainly because of that heart. The heart is going to go in and invade that left side. So if we go back to this, look, they took that heart out. But that's going to be where that heart is going to sit. So that's why that left lung is going to be smaller and narrower. So you have this little cardiac notch that's going to be found on that lung, on that left lung, to accommodate the heart. And look, if you look at this medial view, it has a cardiac impression as well, and that's going to also be where the heart is going to kind of invade part of the lung space right there. So it's kind of interesting. Here's the different lobes. The right lung is going to have 3 lobes, and the left lung is going to have 2 lobes. As you can see, they're just named by where they sit. Look, superior lobe, that's a middle lobe. This one does not have a middle lobe because there's only 2. Inferior lobe. And that is going to go, it's going to go with how many secondary or lobar bronchi we have. Remember the bronchi, so if this is the trachea, and then you have the primary bronchi, over on the right side, you had 3 branches. They didn't branch perfectly like that. And then over here on the left side, you only had 2 of these secondary or lobar bronchi. And the reason why is because they accommodate the amount of lobes that each lung is going to have. So that's kind of interesting. And now we're going to, next we're going to talk about how the tertiary are going to branch off of those, and they are going to go along with how many segments they're going to be found inside of the lungs. But as you can see, look, you have your, if you take a look here, you have your pulmonary veins and arteries, and there's those main bronchi or pulmonary bronchi kind of sitting outside. Other than that, I think that's, you have fissures. You don't have to worry about the different fissures or anything like that. So let's take a look at these little segments that the tertiary bronchi are going to kind of break apart, or branch. I guess I should say branch, because they're not going to break off of the bronchi, right? So the lungs are going to be partitioned into these bronchopulmonary segments. And what's really interesting about these is that they're autonomous, meaning that each of these segments are going to be encapsulated in their own connective tissue, and they're going to have their own pulmonary artery, their own pulmonary vein, their own lymphatic vessels. So the right is going to have more than the left, right? Because the right's going to be bigger. The right side is going to have 10 bronchopulmonary segments, and the left is going to have anywhere from 8 to 10, really just depending on what happens in development. So what's really great about them being autonomous is that if one of the segments, if part of the lung becomes diseased, they don't have to go in and take the entire lobe or the entire lung. Look, they can just go in and take off that diseased segment, and you'll have a healthy lung that's going to be left over. So that is interesting there. So let's take a look at some issues with the lungs. We're going to be taking a look at smoking, and then we'll take a look at lung cancer, because one of the, I guess, what do I want to say? Causes. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. One of the causes of lung cancer can be smoking. So let's look at smoking first. If you think about smoking, you are taking in like about 200 different chemicals into your body, and really they're going into your lungs. So carbon monoxide, nicotine are going to be just a couple of those 200, roughly 200. Lots of drastic and deleterious effects are going to happen from smoking. You're more prone to respiratory infections. One of the things that happens is that smoking will go in and paralyze the cilia, and they can actually go in and completely destroy the cilia over a certain amount of time, down inside of the conducting zone. So what you have is the cilia is not going to be able to move that mucus out, and so it just kind of sits there in parts of the lung, and bacteria is going to go in and reproduce, and so that can lead to respiratory infections. That's one way that it can lead to respiratory infections. It can cause cellular and genetic changes to the lungs as well, so it can kind of go in and change the epithelium of the lungs, and that's the different parts of the lungs. Emphysema is going to be a lot more common in those that smoke. We'll talk more about emphysema later on. Cancer of the lungs, esophagus, stomach, and pancreas. You're more prone to H. pylori, which can cause more stomach ulcers, more prone to atherosclerosis. Let's talk about what we covered as far as smoking in the cardiovascular center. Remember, we talked about how nicotine is going to go in and cause vasoconstriction. So that is going to cause issues with blood flow, right? It is going to go in and increase resistance, and that decreases blood flow, but the body is going to go in and try and compensate by increasing pressure. Another thing that we didn't get to mention is, or we'll talk a little bit about carbon monoxide, hopefully, if we can get to it. But the carbon monoxide that comes with smoking will go in and attach to hemoglobin and take over oxygen's spot, which is not good, right? Because you need oxygen. So this is going to cause a lot of issues getting the right amount of oxygen to your tissue. So sometimes individuals that have smoked for a while can have thicker or more viscous blood because the body's looking at it thinking, hey, there's not a whole lot of oxygen, so we need to make more red blood cells. So that's an issue. If you smoke while you're pregnant, it causes a lower birth weight. We already talked about the poor delivery of oxygen. And look at all of the different issues that are going to occur here with smoking. Bronchitis, asthma, which can lead to COPD, ear infections. This is just taking a look at what can happen from secondhand smoke. But make sure you know that people that smoke themselves are going to be more prone to bronchitis and asthma. So let's take a look at lung cancer, again, caused by smoking in 85% of the cases. So this is obviously highly aggressive malignancy with early metastasis. So lung cancer is actually going to be the #1 cause of cancer deaths in the United States. So every country is going to have their different, I guess, #1 cancer death. And in the United States, it's going to be lung cancer. Some of the symptoms is going to be chronic cough, coughing up blood, excessive pulmonary mucus, increased pulmonary infections. It's going to originate in the respiratory epithelium, so that's why when we're taking a look at these 3 patterns, look, squamous cell cancer, that's going to be the most common, and it is going to arise from the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. What happens, look, we talked about how cellular and genetic changes can happen to lungs. This is what happens. It's when that pseudostratified columnar epithelium changes to stratified squamose. And it does that because it's thinking, hey, I need to go in and protect this body, protect these lungs from the smoke. Not necessarily just lungs, because look, it can happen to the esophagus as well. It can happen to the stomach. It can happen to the pancreas. But since we're talking about lungs specifically, that is what's happening. But it can also happen to the esophagus, where we'll talk about how you do have a certain type of epithelium, and it can change over to stratified squamose, and it completely loses the function that the lungs are going to excuse me, that the lungs are going to need. There is the adenocarcinoma, arises from mucin producing glands, and then there is a small cell carcinoma, which is going to originate from neuroendocrine cells of the bronchi. So let's move on and talk about circulation and innervation. There's 2 types of circulation in the lungs. There is going to be pulmonary circulation, which is shown down here, and we've already covered pulmonary circulation. Remember, that's going to be that circulation that goes from the heart over to the lungs to pick up oxygen, dump off carbon dioxide, and goes back to the heart. So we won't cover that again. But you also have a bronchial circulation, and the bronchial circulation is going to be part of the systemic circulation. Really, its main function is to transport oxygenated blood to the tissues of the lungs. The book goes into the bronchial circulation a lot more, and you don't have to worry about that. But again, if you're going to a respiratory field, you might want to take a look at that. So this is showing how the alveoli respiratory gas exchange is going to occur, because you have these wonderful pulmonary capillaries that are going to completely surround the alveoli, and that is going to be where gas exchange takes place. And remember, we kind of zoomed in on that and looked at the respiratory membrane in the last section. There's also lymph drainage. So remember, I talked about how there's going to be some lymph vessels here. And so you have these lymphatic vessels and nodes. They're going to be located within the lungs, around the bronchi and the pleura. What they're doing is they're going in and removing excess fluid from the lungs. In a second, when we talk about the pleural membranes and the pleural cavity, we'll talk about how they're really important in making sure that it is kind of regulating that fluid in the pleural cavity. But the lymph is going to be, of course, filtered through the lymph nodes, which we know that already from the lymphatic system. And what it's doing, it's going in and filtering out any carbon, any of environmental particles and pollutants that was not removed by the mucus escalator, the mucus and the cilia. So that's the importance of those lymph nodes. Sometimes those lymph nodes and the lungs can become very, very dark because of all of the pollutants that it's going in and filtering out from the environment. So that's kind of scary to know, right? As far as innervation, autonomic nervous system, because again, these are going to be these visceral internal organs, so it's going to be mainly an autonomic nervous system. It's going to innervate smooth muscles and glands. So we're not talking about what's going in and innervating those skeletal muscles of the larynx, or to help us move different muscles, skeletal muscles over there. This is mainly looking at what's going in and innervating the smooth muscles and glands of respiratory structures. So for the larynx, it originates from the vagus. What's interesting is that if the vagus is damaged, that can go in and give rise to an individual with a constant hoarse voice or even a monotone voice as well. So that's kind of interesting, right? Bronchioles receive sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. As far as the lungs and looking at what would happen with the bronchioles as well, anytime that there is sympathetic innervation to the lungs or those bronchioles, it is going to cause bronchodilation. It's going to open up those airways. And we'll talk about later on in another section what would cause those why would we want bronchodilation, bronchoconstriction to occur. Sympathetic is going to cause bronchoconstriction. So let's go ahead and finish by talking about these pleural membranes in the pleural cavity. So if we remember about these serous membranes, so the pleura is going to be the serous membrane that lines the outer lungs and the adjacent wall cavity. So remember, you always have two serous membranes, right? You're going to have the one that sits directly on top of the organ, as you can see right here. So that is going to be, there it goes. That one is going to be that visceral pleura that sits right on top of the lung. And then the one that sits on the thoracic wall cavity out here, and it also is going to kind of sit along the diaphragm, parts of the mediastinum. That one is going to be that parietal pleura. What's really interesting is each of these are going to have their own pleural membrane. And of course the heart, remember, has its own pleural membrane as well. So that's going to be really important to help limit any infections from spreading. We'll also talk about, if one lung collapses because of some kind of puncture, then you do have the other one that is going to be able to, there for gas exchange to occur, for the whole respiration to occur, I guess. As far as that pleural cavity, remember we talked about the pericardial cavity, and so you do have a pleural cavity that's in between those two membranes. And usually, though, that visceral and parietal pleura are almost touching. They are very, very close together. So there is some fluid, some serous fluid that's going to be found in there. It's not a whole lot. Look, there's only about 15 milliliters of fluid. And it says that when the lungs are inflated, it is considered a potential space. And when it says potential space, it means that it has the potential to be a space, but it's usually not a big space because those visceral and parietal pleuras are almost touching. And we're going to talk about how important it is that they are almost touching to kind of keep those lungs open. Again, there's that lymph. The serous fluid is continuously drained from the lymph. It's made by the serous membranes, but drained by the lymph there. And they're really important as well for lubrication. So whenever the lungs inflate, deflate, we'll talk about with inspiration, expiration, how they are going to, of course, move. And that is going to make sure that those pleural surfaces are going to slide easily across one another. So let's talk about how the lungs remain inflated. And the reason why we need to talk about that is because of the lungs tissue. The lungs are mainly this elastic connective tissue. So if you think about elastic connective tissue, it's like a rubber band. If you stretch out a rubber band and let go, it's going to want to snap back. That's what the lungs' elastic connective tissue will want to naturally do, is just to recoil and shrivel up. That's an inward force. So again, inward force meaning that it's going to want to kind of shrivel up and go inward. But there's another opposing force in the lungs, and this is going to be that importance of how the pleural and the two pleura, the visceral and parietal pleura, are going to kind of stick together because of the serous fluid. And it's because of this surface tension of the serous fluid. I like to think of this outward force and what's happening between the visceral and parietal pleura as what's happening when you are drinking. You have this, say you have this glass of water, and it's made of glass. You put a lot of ice in it, and you put some water in it, and you're drinking, and then you set it on a glass coaster. You leave for a little bit and all that condensation occurs, and then you go to pick it up and drink again, and the glass coaster is still sticking to the bottom, right? That is going to kind of be what this outward force is going to be, how these two kind of substances, and because of this fluid between them, help them stick together. And that's really good because of the fact that you have this outward force and you have this pressure in the pleural cavity called intrapleural pressure. And the fact that it is going to be less than the pressure inside of the lungs, that's what keeps the lungs inflated, is the difference between these two pressures. And so it's not a whole lot. It's only about 4 millimeters of mercury, but still it's enough to where it is going to keep the lungs inflated. Let's talk about what happens whenever these two pressures equal one another. So again, you always want this pressure, the pressure inside of the lungs, the intrapulmonary or intraalveolar pressure. You can use those interchangeably. We'll talk more about these pressures in the next section. You always want this to be greater than the intrapleural pressure. So let's talk about what happens whenever they're not. They're going to be equal. A pneumothorax is going to be when air leaks into the pleural cavity, and it can be because of a stab wound or a gunshot wound or anything introduced externally, or it can be whenever air is going to get inside from like a rib. Maybe you broke a rib and it goes in and punctures the lung that way, or the alveoli is going to rupture. Anytime that you go in and destroy the integrity of that pleural cavity, of those two membranes that are going in and sticking to one another, you're ripping that coaster off of the back, off of the bottom of your glass. That's what's going to cause those two pressures to equalize, and that's what leads to something called atelectasis, which is going to be a collapsed lung, right there. And it is going to remain collapsed until the air is removed from that pleural space. So that's it for the lungs, and that's really it for the anatomy. From here on out, it's going to be the physiology. We're going to be taking a look at this whole process of respiration. We'll look at pulmonary ventilation, we'll look at gas exchange, and we're going to look at gas transport. So the next section that we're going to be taking a look at is the whole process behind pulmonary ventilation. So until next time.